Currently, I work in the finance division for a large not-for-profit financial institution. Last year, during one of the federal holidays, when we were closed for business, all 3,000 employees from our headquarters and over 50 locations traveled in and gathered together for the first time at a large convention center for an event called Day of Purpose. We had an entire day together where employees from every part of the organization could take one day away from work and instead focus on what it means to be a part of our organization and remember our purpose and identity together. We even got these sweatshirts that I'm wearing with purpose on it. We had guest speakers, breakout sessions, workshops, team building activities, community service projects, and networking time together, all to remember and strengthen our identity as employees of an organization that exists for one purpose. We exist to serve our members and their communities. It doesn't matter which division we work in, like finance, like me, or marketing, operations, technology, or in one of our branches or financial centers. And it doesn't matter what our day-to-day responsibilities are. Everything we do, from financial transactions to customer service, puts our members first. We talk about who we are and who we are not, what makes us different from our competitors, what our priorities are, and our goals and strategy for the future. This was an intentional time to bring us together and remind us of our identity and purpose together. What was funny to me was I was spending the whole day being a part of this, listening to people talk about purpose, identity, what's your motivation, why do we do this, who do we serve? And I couldn't help but think about my own faith and my purpose in God, which I know is the only eternal purpose out there. Well, I want to bring our attention to a different group of people who thousands of years ago had their own day of purpose. God had delivered his people, the Israelites, from slavery under the Egyptians and brought them into the wilderness. They had spent many generations as slaves in a foreign land, surrounded by foreign religion, foreign culture. Most, if not all, had probably forgotten their identity as Israelites and as people of God and who their God was. Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, their ancestors. The Israelites would spend the next entire generation roaming the wilderness before finally entering into the promised land that God had prepared for them. The land they were about to enter was where their ancestors had lived and worshipped God. But during Israel's time in Egyptian captivity, other people groups, namely the Canaanites, but many other tribes and nations, had come to occupy the land. These people also had their own cultures and religions, so God wanted his people to pause and remember their own identity as people of God before encountering all these other people groups. In Exodus 20, 1 through 17, God speaks to Moses the 10 Commandments to deliver to Israel. He sets the context by reminding them in verse 2. I'm going to read that for you. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then continuing in verses 3 through 17, the commandments themselves. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. And there's more detail about that. Going on to verse 12, honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, wife, servant, and other possessions. And there's a lot more detail there than I read. But these are the 10 commandments that many of us are familiar with. And you know what? There's a lot of misunderstanding about the 10 commandments. Some think that they are a long list of rules that are restricting us. Others think that these commandments are what you need to obey to earn salvation. Others think that these commandments are outdated, they're ancient, or they don't apply to Christians today. However, I just want to remind us that fundamentally, the 10 Commandments and all of the other Old Testament laws are intended to show us who God is, his character, his heart, his priorities. And yes, they also represent his standards and righteousness too, and they tell us how to live and what's right and wrong. But ultimately, the laws and the commandments are God reminding us, this is who I am. Israel was about to be surrounded by other people worshiping idols, worshiping other gods, and living in ways contrary to Yahweh's character. This was God telling his people, this is who I am, not what you see out there. This is who you are, and how you are different than the Canaanites and the other people. You're people who live and carry yourself differently than the rest of the world. Now, I just want to answer a few questions that I mentioned earlier. Is the Old Testament still valid? Does the law still apply? In Matthew 5:17, Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." By itself, the Old Testament is incomplete, but it points to the fullness and freedom that comes from Jesus Christ. Do we obey the law to earn salvation? In John 14:15 said, Jesus said, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." The commandments and the law are not a way to earn salvation. That is found only in Jesus Christ. However, keeping the commandments is a response out of the overflow of Christ's love in us. And lastly, if you're feeling like it's too difficult to remember, let alone keep all of God's commands, just remember this. When someone asked Jesus in Matthew 22:36 through 40, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depends all of the law and the prophets." Everything points to this. Love God and love others. Love God and love others. Sadly, I've seen Christians on social media talk about things like their definite chief aim and their clear vision and true potential to make lots of money and build wealth, and write these goals down to remind themselves about that. Others make their purpose and identity about their families, or their success, or their education, or even their appearance. These aren't bad things, but these are not our purpose. Everything begins with God, his love for us, and out of that love, his invitation to love him and to love others. Everything else flows out of that. Friends, as we continue into the new year, I think we can all use a day of purpose to remember who God is and our identities as people of God. We live in a world that has become increasingly different, contrary, and even hostile to the heart, character, and priorities of our God. But as we get busy in life and go about the year, it's easy to start living like the rest of the world and forget who we are. May we all be reminded about the gift of God's revelation through the Ten Commandments, the law, the Old Testament, that continues to give life to us today, the love and majesty of our God, and who we are as God's people.